Hi, I'm Lena and this is Ksenia. And I have a pot problem. Specifically, this plant pot on this box. This box is tall and narrow and I'm afraid that this plant is gonna tip over. Plus, it's a box. So I asked Patrick to make a plant stand for me. And while he designed it, he of course made us build it.
Okay, as Lena said, Pat made a design for her in SketchUp before dumping the whole thing on us. Anyway, here's a shot of the design with most of the major dimensions shown. Quick overview. The top of the table is going to be made from maple, a light-colored wood, while the legs are going to be made from purple hard, which as name suggests, is purple. The legs cross each other at 45 degrees relative to the tabletop, which makes the table look a little like a camp chair. This puts more stress on the legs since they aren't just getting pushed down, but also bent to the side. They also contain a feature at the top that slots into data in the tabletop, and this feature is going to be difficult to make, thanks to the inside corner there. The red cylinders you see are walnut dowels that pin the legs to each other, and the legs to the tabletop. This will greatly improve the strength of the table, as we won't be relying on glue alone to hold things together. Alright, now we have an idea of what we're building, let's jump right in. Alright, safety first. Lena first installed the riving knife, a very important anti-kickback device that will be missed later. She then raised the blade the minimum above the work, plugged in the saw and put on safety glasses. We unplugged the saw for any work on the saw, such as blade changes. After that, we needed to square up the rough-cut purple heart we will use for the legs. To do this, Lena first put down a couple strips of double-sided tape and then stuck a straight-edged piece of MDF to the top. The MDF rides against the fence and results in a straight cut, since the cut follows the MDF instead of the rough edge of the work. With one straight edge, she can simply flip the work over and cut the other edge to get two parallel sides. We're cutting with a flat ground ripping blade, which we used for the entire project. Nice! Here she's setting the fence to blade distance to the width of our legs. We use a metal scale and measure from the fence to the near edge of the blade tooth so the width is exact. Now the width was set, she cut 4 identical leg blanks from our purple heart board. This board isn't completely flat and experienced chatter from not contacting the table completely. We attached printed 1-to-1 scale drawings of the legs to the leg blanks with double-sided tape. This allowed us to cut to the template rather than dealing with laying out the somewhat complex angles by hand. After setting the width and attaching a fingerboard to the table to keep the work against the fence, Lena started the first cut to shape the leg. She had to cut up to the shoulder of the leg template without cutting through, which is why you see her stop, hold the work in place, and shut off the saw. After the first leg was cut, she just transferred the stop line over to the remaining legs and cut them with the same setup. She did start using a second push stick to hold the work down. This worked well and stopped the chatter. Next up, I set up a stop block on the miter saw and cut the top of leg angles. Of course, I messed up on the first leg and cut the foot instead of the top. But that's alright, as these blanks were still longer than we needed for the finished project. Could have been bad. All done! To cut the next 45-degree cut on the legs, we set up a jig using our home-built crosscut sled and a giant triangle. This let us get a perfect 45 every time, which is important as this cut mates with the top of the table. Lena had to do several passes and sneak up on the shoulder so she didn't overcut into the leg and ruin it. After getting the setup just right with the first leg, she was able to repeat the cut perfectly on the remaining 3. This worked really well. Since the first cut is interrupted due to the table saw blade cutting a circle instead of a nice perpendicular line, Lena had to complete the cut using a coping saw. Since we're idiots, we tried doing this on a table saw, where the leg flopped around and it took forever. Pat suggested using the vise that was right there to hold the leg while cutting. This took 20 seconds to cut compared to 23 seconds on the table saw, after speeding it up 1,000%. Of course, Lena didn't drop the leg on the ground with the table saw method. The coping saw cut was not nearly as nice as the machine finish from the table saw, and so Lena and I had to use sandpaper and a chisel to clean up the corners. This leg was so far off that it was quicker for her to cut it again than sand it. This was the first time I used the hammer and chisel to shape wood. Pat gave me about 20 seconds of training and then set me loose. After we got the shape of the legs correct, we used coarse sandpaper to smooth them and clean up any surface imperfections or saw marks. All that done, I cut the legs to the final length with a double 45-degree mitered foot. The legs cross at 45 degrees, so these cuts I'm making now will create a flat foot on one edge and a flat on the outside of the legs. And here's the legs complete! I'm amazed we were able to make these and have them look so good. Very nice! Legs done, time to start on the top. This is a 1-inch thick maple board with rough edges. Lena is using the crosscut sled again to both square the sides to the bottom edge and make them parallel to each other. This worked quite well. Alright, cleaning up the final edge without the crosscut sled now. And forgot to put the riving knife back in. Remember, the riving knife is a very important safety device and should always be in place when cutting wood that isn't fully supported. Luckily, Lena was able to get away without it for a couple cuts. And there's the perfectly square tabletop done. Oh no! Let's see what happened. She's pushing the work in from the edge farthest from the blade, which worked right up until this moment. Here she's moved her hand from the front edge of the board, which was keeping it against the fence, and immediately the wood twists towards the blade. Anyway, now there's a big chunk missing from the board, so we decided to make the table a tiny bit narrower by cutting off the worst of the gouged edge, with the riving knife in place and the stern talking to before being let into the shop again. We had to turn the board 90 degrees and cut that edge as well to keep the top a square rather than a rectangle. I think the table ended up a 1/4 inch smaller in each dimension. Since this is wood, the legs aren't perfect copies of each other, so we numbered the 4 spots where the leg cutouts will go and numbered the legs as well. We did this since the legs are not exactly the same thickness due to sanding and such. By numbering them, the tabletop leg datas will match to the legs so they fit perfectly. Here, Lena laid out the outside data edge with a tri-square, then placed each leg next to their corresponding number and scribed the inner data edge. These two lines describe the width of the cut that the leg fits into and must be exact. Finally, she traced her scribe lines with a pencil and marked the area with an X, shown here like this is a 90s Greatest Police Chases episode. After marking out the leg datas for one side of the table, she then started very carefully making cuts to the scribe lines, without going over. These will be the shoulder cuts and are critical, since they set the final width of the dado. After getting the shoulder cuts perfect, Lena just had to make repeating overlapping cuts from one shoulder to the other. This left a square, flat-bottomed dado thanks to our flat-ground cross-cut blade. What followed next was an endless series of tiny shoulder cuts, until the fit between the tabletop and leg looked close enough we could sand the dado to fit.
Yeah.
We then spent approximately a million years sanding the dado and trying the leg back and forth over and over again. We got tired of this pretty fast, so back to the table saw for one more cut. And now the dado is too wide. Awesome. The process for the remaining leg was the same, minus the sanding to fit. Forget that. Well, I guess sometimes lucky is better than good. Now both legs fit on the first edge of the table. They were placed in their dados and flat against the tabletop, so the far side dado edges could be marked accurately. Since they cross, the legs are offset on the second side by the width of the legs on the first side. After everything was marked out, the cutting and fitting process was repeated for these two legs. Still fun to watch though. Okay, it was tedious. Well, that exploded. Glad everyone was wearing safety glasses. Splinters hit me from across the room. And here's progress. Legs fit in their slots. They're still floppy, but we'll fix that later. Next up, glue. We had quite a bit of trouble getting the legs in their slots with glue on them. Seems they swell up when wet. Oops. This caused some panic since we thought the glue would dry before we got the legs in place. Luckily, we had a hammer. Anyway, we used all 3 of our clamps to hold the legs in place and called it a day. Yay, it's a table! Still very weak though. We need to install dowels to solve that problem. Lena measured the distance between the 2 inner legs for a spacer And I cut a bit of scrap to that size. This actually fit really well. We must be getting some basic level of ability. Wow! Next, I marked out the center of the cross for each pair of legs. Next, Lena cut another spacer to fill the space between the outer legs and the edge of the table. This will make sense in a minute. Demonstrating a complete lack of wits, Lena had trouble getting the spacer to work initially, but figured it out eventually. Another perfect-sized part. Next, I test drilled a scrap of purple heart with a 3/8 drill bit, and compared the ease of drilling and the resulting hole to a 3/8 Forstner bit. The Forstner bit won, as it made a slightly smaller than dowel hole, and we could sand the dowel to size. Time to drill. The spacers will create a transfer the drill force straight through to the drill press table, so we aren't bending the legs over during drilling. The cheap drill press chuck kept loosening and the bit slid up while drilling. Despite the problems with the chuck, I was able to get these holes drilled through without breaking anything. Hole 1 complete, we flipped it over and did it all again. Next, Lena measured the approximate length of the dowels needed and cut them from a 3/8 inch walnut dowel rod. We then had to hand sand these dowels while checking their fitment with the holes I drilled in the legs. It was extremely tedious. Sand check, sand check. Finally, Lena got her dowel to fit and glued it in. Finally, my dowel fit. This caused a temporary loss of sanity as I contemplated having to do this ever again. And then I had to do it again for the tabletop to leg dowels. Yay! I had to use the 3/8 inch drill for these holes due to the depth required to go from the edge of the table all the way through the leg. This also meant I didn't have to sand any dowels, which was good for my continued sanity. I'm peck drilling these holes to clear out the wood chips and ensure no burning or tear out occurs. It would totally suck to crack the tabletop now. Measuring the dowel lengths, cutting the dowels, gluing them in. This is so much easier. Here I'm taping over the ends of the dowels so they don't slip out while we glue in the opposite side dowels. Alright, just about done here. Okay, the legs aren't exactly the same height as the dados, but this was expected. We can now clamp the table into the vise, apply masking tape around the leg, and grind the offending extra height off with a belt sander. Careful not to gouge the tabletop. The tape helps as it gets damaged or pulls off when you get close. Here you can see how Lena brought in the top of the leg to a close tolerance with the tabletop by repeatedly sanding and checking progress. Once all legs were done, we scribbled pencil across the tabletop to show high and low spots for later sanding. Next up, the extra dowel lengths were ground down to the surface. Finally, Lena sanded the sides of the legs to match the edge of the tabletop. After the rough grinding work was done, I took over with a palm sander and started finish sanding everything. Of course, the palm sander doesn't fit everywhere, so parts of this still had to be done by hand. It's really starting to come together now. You can't feel it, but after the sanding, the top felt like glass. It was so satisfying. Sanding done, we cleaned the area up with air and damp cloth and prepped for finish. I wiped the entire table, including the bottom and the legs, with acetone until the cloth came off entirely clean. This gets rid of any dust or oil that may get in the finish. We used a spray lacquer product to clear coat the table. Lena has never sprayed anything, so she got to do it. This gave me scapegoat in case something went wrong, plus it is her table. I pointed out all the spots she missed. So helpful. A few hours later, I lightly sanded the lacquer until it was smooth, cleaned everything again, and sprayed on a second coat. I then died from lacquer fumes. We will have to wait until the next day to see how it turned out. It turned out pretty good.
All that's left is to put the plant on the stand and see how it looks like. It looks really nice.
Looks good. I like it.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy watching this video.
If you like videos like this, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing. We produce a range of woodworking and carpentry content. Also, we now have a Patreon page if you would like to contribute to the channel. This goes directly towards making the channel better, and you'll get our thanks as well. Anyway, until next time.